They say money talks, but in Richard Sterling's world it screamed. He walked into that courtroom thinking he had already won. He had the high-priced lawyers, the hidden offshore accounts, and a smirk that told his wife Audrey she was leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back. He picked up the pen, signed the divorce papers, and looked at her with pure mockery. But Richard made one fatal mistake. He forgot that the dead can still speak. When Judge Halloway opened a sealed envelope left by Richard's late father, a document no one knew existed, that smirk didn't just fade. It evaporated. What happened next wasn't just a divorce hearing. It was a public execution of an ego. Stay tuned, because you won't believe who actually owned the empire. The air inside Courtroom 4B of the Superior Court of California was stale, smelling faintly of lemon polish and anxiety. It was a place where love went to die, usually strangled by billable hours and bitter accusations. For Richard Sterling, however, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a business transaction, a liquidation of a depreciating asset. He sat at the mahogany table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit. He checked his reflection in the screen of his phone, smoothing back a stray hair. He was 42, handsome, in a shark-like way, with eyes that assessed everything by its price tag. Beside him sat his attorney, Greg Prentice, a man known in legal circles as the Butcher, for how he carved up spouses in settlements. "Relax, Richard," Prentice whispered, leaning in. "We have the prenup. We have the forensic accounting showing the business's premarital property. She gets the Honda. The apartment lease is in her name, and you keep the portfolio. It's a slam dunk." Richard chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the quiet room. "I'm not worried, Greg. I just want this over with. Jessica is waiting for me in Aspen. We have a flight at 3. Across the aisle, Audrey Sterling sat alone. Technically, she had a lawyer, a court-appointed mediator named Mrs. Gable, who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. But Audrey felt entirely solitary. She wore a simple beige dress, one she had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago. Her hands were folded in her lap, her knuckles white. She looked smaller than she was, diminished by 10 years of marriage to a man who treated affection like a currency he was hoarding. "Mrs. Sterling," Mrs. Gable asked softly, "are you ready? The judge is about to enter." Audrey nodded, not trusting her voice. She wasn't fighting for money. She wasn't fighting for the Hampton estate or the penthouse in Manhattan. She just wanted out. She wanted to breathe again without wondering if her breath offended Richard. 10 years ago, she had been Audrey Miller, a bright-eyed graphic designer with dreams of owning a gallery. Then she met Richard. He had been charming, sweeping her off her feet with grand gestures that felt like love, but turned out to be ownership. Slowly, systematically, he had dismantled her life. First, he didn't like her friends. They were too loud. Then he didn't like her job. It was distracting. Then he didn't like her opinions. Now she was 34, and she felt 80. "All rise," the bailiff boomed. Judge Leonard Halloway entered the room. He was a man of imposing stature, with a bald head that gleamed under the fluorescent lights and a beard as white as snow. He had been on the bench for 30 years. He had seen every lie, every tear, and every scheme humanity had to offer. He sat down, the heavy black robe settling around him like a storm cloud, and adjusted his spectacles. "Be seated," Judge Halloway rumbled. He opened the file in front of him, the papers rustling loudly in the silence. "We are here for the matter of Sterling versus Sterling, docket number 4492, petition for dissolution of marriage. He looked over his glasses at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, you are the petitioner. I am your honor," Richard said, his voice smooth, projecting the confidence of a man who owned the building. "And Mrs. Sterling, you are the respondent." "Yes, Your Honor," Audrey whispered. "Speak up, please," Halloway said, not unkindly. "Yes, Your Honor," she repeated louder this time. "Very well," Halloway said. "I have reviewed the settlement agreement proposed by Mr. Sterling's counsel. It appears one-sided." Greg Prentice stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, the couple signed a prenuptial agreement 10 years ago. It explicitly states that in the event of a divorce, all assets acquired by Mr. Sterling remain his sole property. Mrs. Sterling agreed to these terms. We are merely enforcing the contract." Halloway looked at Audrey. "Mrs. Sterling, is this true? Do you contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement?" Audrey looked at Richard. He was staring at the wall, bored, tapping his expensive pen against the table. He didn't even look at her. To him, she was already gone. "No, Your Honor," Audrey said, her voice trembling. "I signed it. I just want to leave." Richard smirked. It was a small, quick twisting of his lips, but Audrey saw it. It was the look he gave when a waiter dropped a fork or when a competitor went bankrupt. It was the look of absolute victory. "Very well," Judge Halloway sighed. He looked disappointed, like a teacher watching a student fail a test on purpose. "If there are no contests, we can proceed to the signing of the decree." Richard leaned over to his lawyer. "Told you," he whispered. "Easiest merger I've ever closed." The bailiff brought the heavy document to Richard's table first. It was thick, filled with legal jargon that essentially boiled down to one sentence: Richard wins, Audrey loses. Richard uncapped his fountain pen, a Mont Blanc gold nibbed worth more than Audrey's car. He signed his name with a flourish. Richard A. Sterling. The signature was large, aggressive, taking up more space than necessary. He pushed the papers toward the bailiff, his eyes locking with Audrey's across the aisle. He didn't speak, but his expression was loud. "You are nothing without me. You are going back to the gutter where I found you." The bailiff carried the papers to Audrey. She hesitated. Her hand shook as she picked up the cheap ballpoint pen provided by the court. "Just sign it, Audrey," Richard called out, ignoring the decorum of the court. "Don't drag this out. Jessica is waiting." The mention of the name Jessica sent a shockwave through the room. Even the stenographer paused. Jessica was Richard's personal assistant, a 22-year-old model he had been parading around town for the last 6 months. He hadn't even tried to hide the affair. He considered it his right. Judge Halloway's gaze snapped to Richard. "Mr. Sterling, you will address the respondent with respect, or I will hold you in contempt." Silence. Richard rolled his eyes but stayed quiet, crossing his arms. Audrey looked down at the paper. The line for her signature blurred. If she signed this, it was over. The abuse, the gaslighting, the lonely nights in the empty mansion, it would all be legally erased. She would be free. Poor but free. She pressed the pen to the paper. A. U. D. R. E. Y. She signed. It was done. The bailiff took the papers and handed them up to Judge Halloway. The judge took them, reviewed the signatures, and picked up his gavel. Richard was already gathering his things. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Well, that's that. Greg, send the bill to the office." He turned to leave, not even glancing at the woman he had vowed to cherish until death did them part. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Judge Halloway said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of iron. Richard paused, halfway turned. "Excuse me, Your Honor. The papers are signed. We're done here." "I said sit down," Halloway repeated. He didn't look up from the papers. "We are not done. Not by a long shot." A murmur went through the small crowd in the back of the courtroom, mostly law students observing for credit and a few bored retirees. Richard frowned, annoyed. He checked his watch. "Your Honor, I have a flight to catch at—" "If you take one more step toward that door, Mr. Sterling, you will be spending the weekend in a holding cell," Halloway said. He finally looked up, his blue eyes piercing. "Sit. Down." Richard froze. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair. "This is highly irregular," Greg Prentice sputtered. "The decree is signed. The marriage is dissolved." "The marriage is dissolved, yes," Judge Halloway said. He reached under his desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was sealed with red wax, an old-fashioned touch that looked out of place in the modern courtroom. "But the division of assets is not. The prenup covers the assets," Prentice argued, his voice rising. "The prenup covers the assets owned by Richard Sterling," Halloway corrected. "However, this court has received a motion to intervene regarding the estate of the late Arthur Sterling." Richard's face went pale. Arthur Sterling, his father, had died 5 years ago. He was the founder of Sterling Industries, the source of all the family wealth. Richard had inherited everything, or so he thought. "My father is dead," Richard snapped. "His will was probated years ago. I am the sole beneficiary." "You were the sole beneficiary of the known will," Halloway said calmly. He held up the envelope. "But it seems Arthur Sterling was a man of secrets. This document was filed with the High Court 5 years ago, with strict instructions that it was only to be opened in the event of your divorce." The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit. Audrey looked up, confusion knitting her brow. She had liked Arthur. He had been a kind, if stern, old man. He had always treated her with a gentleness Richard never possessed. She remembered the day Arthur died. He had squeezed her hand and whispered, "Wait for the rain, Audrey. Wait for the rain." She never understood what he meant. "This is ridiculous." Richard laughed nervously. "A hidden will. What is this, a movie that's not admissible?" "It is perfectly admissible," Halloway said, breaking the wax seal with a loud crack. "It was notarized by the firm of Caldwell, West and Payne and held in escrow by the state executor." The judge pulled out a sheaf of papers. They were yellowed slightly at the edges. "Shall I read it?" Halloway asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I object," Prentice shouted. "Overruled," Halloway said instantly. He put on his reading glasses and began to read. "I, Arthur James Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my true and final testament regarding the controlling shares of Sterling Industries and the Sterling Family Trust." Halloway paused, looking directly at Richard. "I have watched my son Richard grow into a man I do not recognize. He is ruthless, cruel, and lacks the moral compass required to lead this family. However, I have also watched his wife, Audrey. I have seen her patience, her kindness, and her suffering." Richard's mouth fell open. He looked at Audrey, his eyes wide with shock and fury. Audrey sat frozen, her hand covering her mouth. "Therefore," the judge read on, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "I hereby structure my bequest as follows. If Richard remains happily married to Audrey, he shall act as the CEO and trustee of my estate, drawing a salary while the principal remains in the trust." Halloway turned the page. "However," the judge continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming grave, "should Richard ever file for divorce, or should his behavior cause Audrey to file for divorce, or should the marriage be dissolved for any reason, Richard was gripping the table so hard the wood creaked. "Then the ownership of Sterling Industries, the family trust, the Kensington Manor, and all liquid assets previously held in my name shall bypass Richard entirely." Judge Halloway looked up. A small, satisfied smile played on his lips. "And to whom do they go?" Prentice whispered, dreading the answer. "They shall be transferred in full to the sole ownership of Mrs. Audrey Sterling." For 10 seconds, silence reigned in courtroom 4B. It was a vacuum sucking the air out of the lungs of everyone present. Then the explosion happened. "That's a lie!" Richard roared, leaping from his chair. The expensive mahogany chair skidded backward and toppled over with a deafening clatter. "That is a fraudulent document. My father would never. He hated her. He tolerated her because of me. Sit down, Mr. Sterling." The bailiff moved forward, his hand resting on his taser. "I will not sit down." Richard's face was purple, a vein bulging dangerously in his neck. He pointed a trembling finger at Audrey. She manipulated him. She must have gotten to him when he was sick. Senile, he was out of his mind on morphine. "Mr. Prentice," Judge Halloway said, his voice cutting through Richard, screaming like a scalpel, "control your client or I will have him removed in cuffs, and I assure you the county jail is not as comfortable as the Four Seasons." Greg Prentice, who had gone as pale as the sheets of legal paper scattered on his desk, grabbed Richard's arm. "Richard, stop! Stop right now! You are making it worse." "How can it be worse?" Richard hissed, shaking his lawyer off. "He just gave away my company to her." He looked at Audrey with a mixture of loathing and disbelief, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking French. Audrey hadn't moved. She was staring at the judge, her mind racing. Arthur. She remembered those long afternoons in the garden when Richard was too busy closing deals in Tokyo or London to come home. She remembered pushing Arthur's wheelchair, reading him books, listening to his regrets. "Richard is a shark," Arthur had told her once. "Sharks don't have friends, Audrey. They only have food. Don't let him eat you." She hadn't understood then that he was planning this. A contingency plan. A nuclear option hidden in a safety deposit box. "Your Honor," Prentice said, trying to salvage his own reputation, "with all due respect, this will is 5 years old. It was never filed with the probate court at the time of Arthur Sterling's death. The statute of limitations for contesting the original will has passed." "Ordinarily you would be correct, Mr. Prentice," Judge Halloway said, peering over his spectacles. "However, Arthur Sterling was a meticulous man. He utilized a springing executory interest clause within the Sterling family trust. The assets were technically never Richard's to begin with. They were held in a conditional trust. Richard was merely let's call him the caretaker. The condition for his permanent ownership was a lifelong marriage to Audrey. The moment he signed those divorce papers, the moment the ink hit the page, he violated the condition." The judge held up the divorce decree Richard had just signed with such arrogance. "The signature is fresh," Halloway said. "The condition is broken. The trust triggers immediately." Richard slumped against the table. The smirk was a distant memory. He looked like a man who had walked off a cliff expecting a bridge only to find thin air. "What exactly?" Richard's voice was hoarse. "What exactly does this cover?" Judge Halloway turned a page in the thick document. "Let's see. Item 1. The controlling 51% stake in Sterling Industries, currently valued at $480 million. Richard made a sound like a wounded animal. "Item 2. Halloway continued relentlessly. The Sterling estate in Bel Air, Item 3, the vacation properties in Aspen, Monaco, and St. Bart's. Item 4, the private aviation fleet, specifically the Gulfstream G650. My jet, Richard whispered. He took my jet. And finally, item 5, Halloway finished. All liquid cash reserves held in the Sterling family accounts at Chase Private Client and Goldman Sachs, totaling approximately $75 million. The judge closed the folder. In short, Mr. Sterling, you are leaving this marriage with exactly what you came into it with, which according to my records of your employment prior to your father hiring you is a used Toyota Camry and a student loan debt which I believe your father paid off. You might owe the estate for that. This is insane, Richard muttered, running his hands through his perfectly gelled hair, ruining the style. I built that company. I doubled the profits in the last 5 years. Actually, Audrey spoke. Her voice was quiet, but in the acoustic perfection of the courtroom it carried. Everyone turned to look at her. Actually, she said, her voice gaining strength, you fired the R&D department and cut the safety protocols to boost the quarterly earnings. You didn't build it, Richard. You stripped it for parts. Richard's eyes narrowed. Shut up. You don't know anything about business. You're a graphic designer. You paint pictures. Mrs. Sterling is now the chairwoman of the board, Judge Halloway reminded him. I suggest you speak to her with the deference due to your... Well, she's not your employer, because you don't work there anymore. What? Richard snapped his head back to the judge. I'm the CEO. The will stipulates, Halloway read, that upon the activation of the trust, the board of directors is to immediately remove the current CEO if that person is the offending party in the divorce. An interim CEO will be appointed by the new majority shareholder. The judge gestured to Audrey. That's you, Mrs. Sterling. Audrey looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking. A strange, cold calm was washing over her. For 10 years she had been afraid of Richard. Afraid of his temper, his criticism, his financial control. But looking at him now, sweating, red-faced, powerless, she realized he was small. He was just a small man, standing on a pile of money his father made. And the pile was gone. I want him gone, Audrey said clearly. You can't do that, Richard screamed. I am Sterling Industries. The stocks will tank without me. I want him removed from the building by security, Audrey continued, addressing the judge. And I want a forensic audit of the company accounts for the last 5 years. If he cut safety protocols, I want to know. So ordered. Judge Halloway banged the gavel. The court will issue the transfer orders immediately. Mr. Sterling, you have 24 hours to vacate the Bel Air property. You may take personal effects only. Clothing toiletries. No art, no jewelry, no electronics purchased with company funds. Where am I supposed to go? Richard shouted. I can't check into a hotel. You froze my cards. I'm sure Jessica has a couch, Audrey said. It was the first time she had said the name aloud. It hung in the air, sharp and bitter. Richard stared at her. For the first time in his life, he looked at Audrey and saw something other than an accessory. He saw a threat. Court is adjourned, Halloway announced. The walk from the defendant's table to the heavy oak doors of the courtroom was the longest journey of Richard Sterling's life. Every step felt like walking through molasses. He could feel the eyes of the law students burning into his back. They weren't looking at him with envy anymore. They were looking at him with pity. He burst through the doors into the hallway, Greg Prentice scrambling to keep up. Richard! Wait. We need to strategize, Prentice panted, clutching his briefcase. Strategize! Richard spun around, grabbing Prentice by the lapels of his expensive suit. You told me this was a slam dunk. You told me she would get nothing. Now I'm destitute. I'm paying you $500 an hour." "Greg, fix this. I can file an emergency appeal," Prentice stammered, trying to pry Richard's fingers off his jacket. "We can argue undue influence. We can claim your father wasn't of sound mind. But Richard, the bad boy clause, it's ironclad. It's a recognized legal instrument in estate law. Your father hired the best firm in the country to write that will." "I don't care," Richard shoved him away. "I have a flight to Aspen in 2 hours. I have investors meeting me there. If I don't show up, the deal falls through." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed his chief financial officer, Marcus Thorne. Pick up, you idiot," Richard muttered. "Hello," Marcus answered. The tone was different. It wasn't the usual obsequious deference. It was guarded, cold. "Marcus, listen to me," Richard barked, walking rapidly down the marble corridor. "There's been a clerical error in court, a misunderstanding. I need you to transfer $2 million from the offshore holding in the Caymans to my personal checking immediately. I need liquidity." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I can't do that," Richard Marcus said. "What do you mean you can't? I'm the CEO." "Do it." "Richard, we just received a court order via fax and email. It's signed by Judge Halloway and countersigned by the State Banking Commission. All accounts associated with your Social Security number and the Sterling corporate entities are frozen pending a change of signatory power. My screen is literally locked. I can't move a cent." "Marcus, I swear to God, if you don't, I have to go." "Richard, legal is calling a mandatory all-hands meeting. They say there's a new chairperson." Click. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone. He felt a wave of nausea. This was actually happening. It wasn't a bad dream. The machinery of the empire he thought he ruled had turned against him instantly. It was loyal only to the money, not the man. The doors to the courtroom opened again, and Audrey walked out. She was flanked by Mrs. Gable, her court-appointed lawyer, who looked as stunned as anyone. Mrs. Gable was holding the file like it was a holy relic. Richard saw her, and his survival instinct kicked in. The rage vanished, replaced instantly by the charm that had won her over 10 years ago. He composed his face, forcing a look of sorrow and regret. "Audrey," he said, stepping in her path. His voice was soft, intimate, the voice he used to use when he apologized for working late, with lipstick on his collar. Audrey stopped. She looked at him. She didn't step back. "Audrey, look." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is a mess. My father. He was a complicated man. He clearly wanted to test us." "Test us?" Audrey repeated, her eyebrows raising slightly. "Yes." "Don't you see?" Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice so the lawyers couldn't hear. "He wanted to see if our love was stronger than money. He wanted to see if we would fight for each other. I signed those papers because I was angry, Audrey. I was hurt. But I never wanted this. I never wanted to lose you." He reached out to touch her arm. "We can fix this. We can tear up that decree. We can go back to the judge, tell him we've reconciled. We can run the company together, you and me, king and queen, just like we always said." It was a masterful performance. Tears actually welled up in his eyes. For a second, Greg Prentice looked impressed. Audrey looked down at his hand on her arm, his manicured nails, the gold watch on his wrist that cost more than her parents' house. She remembered the night she cried herself to sleep while he was out with Jessica. She remembered the way he smirked when she begged him for money to fix her car. "Richard," she said softly. Yes, baby. He leaned in, thinking he had her. He knew Audrey. She was soft. She was forgiving. She was weak. You're not crying because you lost me, she said, looking him dead in the eye. You're crying because you lost the jet. Richard's face froze. Audrey reached up and peeled his fingers off her arm, dropping his hand like it was a dead fish. I'm not tearing up anything, she said. The divorce is final. The assets are mine. And Richard. What? He snarled, the mask dropping completely. I'm cancelling the Aspen trip, but don't worry about Jessica. I'm sure she'll stick around now that you're broke. After all, it must be true love, right? She walked past him, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. Mrs. Gable, she said over her shoulder. Let's go get some lunch. I'm paying. And then I'd like to visit my office. Richard stood alone in the hallway. The lawyers, the bystanders, even the janitor mopping the floor seemed to be looking at him. His phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen. A picture of a blonde woman in a bikini popped up. Jessica. He stared at it. The one person who was supposed to be on his side. The reason he blew up his marriage. He answered. Jessica. Baby. Where are you? Her voice was high excited. I'm at the private terminal. The pilot says the flight plan has been cancelled and my credit card just got declined at the duty-free shop. It was so embarrassing. Richard, fix it. Richard closed his eyes. He leaned his head against the cold stone wall of the courthouse. Jessica, he said, his voice hollow. Shut up. Excuse me, Richard. Who do you think you're talking to? I have been waiting. I said shut up. Richard screamed into the phone, causing a passing family to flinch. It's gone. It's all gone. The money, the jet, the house, my father. He screwed me. I have nothing. Jessica, I have zero. There was a pause on the line. A long, heavy silence. What do you mean, zero? Jessica asked, her voice suddenly devoid of the bubbly affectation. Like temporary zero. Or poor people zero. I mean, I might have to sleep in my car tonight if the repo men don't find it first. Richard laughed maniacally. But we have each other, right? That's what matters. Click. The line went dead. No goodbye. No comfort. Just the dial tone. Richard slowly lowered the phone. He looked at the black screen. He looked down the hallway where Audrey had disappeared. He was alone. For the first time in 42 years, Richard Sterling was entirely, completely alone. But the worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the realization that the day was only half over. He still had to go back to the mansion, Audrey's mansion, and pack his bags while she watched. And he knew with a sickening certainty that Audrey wasn't going to make it easy. The drive to the Bel Air estate usually took 40 minutes from the courthouse, today in the back of a taxi that smelled of stale tobacco, because his Uber account was linked to the now frozen credit card. It felt like an eternity. Richard Sterling stared out the window as the familiar wrought-iron gates of his home came into view. His home. He had bought this place 3 years ago to celebrate his first billion-dollar quarter. It was a fortress of limestone and glass, a monument to his ego. The taxi driver pulled up to the keypad. Gate code, he grunted. 1985, Richard said automatically. It was his birth year. The driver punched it in. The keypad beeped a harsh, dissonant tone. Access denied. Try it again, Richard snapped. 1985. Use your finger, not your thumb. You're hitting the wrong keys. The driver glared at him in the rearview mirror, but tried again. Beep. Access denied. It ain't opening, pal. Richard cursed and shoved the door open. He marched up to the intercom, pressing the buzzer furiously. Maria, open the damn gate. The system is glitching again. There was a crackle of static, but it wasn't the housekeeper's voice that answered. It was a deep baritone voice Richard didn't recognize. Mr. Sterling, we've been expecting you. Who is this? Richard demanded. Get off my property. Please wait by the pedestrian entrance. Someone will come down to escort you. Escort him. On his own property, Richard kicked the gate, scuffing the toe of his Italian leather shoe. A moment later, the side door clicked open. Standing there was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. He wore a dark suit and earpiece and an expression of professional indifference. I'm Mr. Graves, the man said, head of security for Mrs. Sterling. I'll be supervising your retrieval of personal effects. Mrs. Sterling, Richard scoffed, brushing past him. She's been the lady of the house for 10 minutes, and she thinks she needs a Praetorian guard. Where is she? I want to talk to her. Mrs. Sterling is indisposed, Graves said, falling into step beside Richard. His stride was long, matching Richard's frantic pace effortlessly. You have 30 minutes, Mr. Sterling. After that, you will be trespassing. Richard stormed up the long driveway. The grounds were immaculately kept, the roses in full bloom. He reached the massive front door and threw it open. The foyer was cool and silent. Usually he would shout for a drink the moment he walked in. Maria Scotch neat. But today, the silence was heavy. He walked into the living room and froze. Audrey was there. She was sitting in the high-backed velvet armchair near the fireplace. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pacing. She was simply reading a magazine. On the table beside her was a cup of tea and a plate of biscuits. Standing in the corner was Maria the housekeeper. Maria, who had worked for them for 6 years. Maria, whom Richard had threatened to fire at least once a month for leaving streaks on the windows. Maria, Richard barked, get me a drink, and get my suitcases from the storage closet. Maria looked at Richard. Then she looked at Audrey. Audrey didn't look up from her magazine. She turned a page slowly. Maria, would you mind refreshing my tea, please? Of course, Mrs. Sterling, Maria said warmly. She walked right past Richard as if he were a ghost picking up Audrey's teacup and heading for the kitchen. Richard stood there, his mouth agape. The betrayal stung more than the court ruling. His help had switched allegiance instantly. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Richard hissed, turning his venom on Audrey. Sitting there like the Queen of Sheba. Audrey finally looked up. Her eyes were clear. I'm not enjoying it, Richard. I'm just present. For the first time in years, I'm actually present in my own house without worrying about what mood you're in. It's not your house, Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. It's my money that paid for it. Actually, Mr. Graves interrupted, stepping forward. According to the trust deed, the property was purchased via a shell corporation wholly owned by Sterling Industries, which is now owned by Mrs. Sterling. You are a guest, and a loud one. Richard spun on his heel and stormed up the grand staircase. He needed to get to the safe. He had cash there, emergency cash, gold coins, watches, things the lawyers couldn't trace. He burst into the master bedroom. He went straight to the walk-in closet, shoving his suits aside to reveal the wall safe. He punched in the code. Click. The door swung open. It was empty. Richard stared into the dark metal void. Where is it? He whispered. He spun around. "Where is it?" he screamed at Graves, who was standing in the doorway. "There was 50,000 in cash in there, and my Patek Philippe collection. All assets located on the property have been inventoried and secured by the forensic accounting team," Graves said calmly. "Items purchased with commingled funds or corporate accounts are frozen until the audit is complete." "The watches were gifts," Richard lied. "From my father. If you have the gift receipts or probate records proving that you can file a claim with the executor," Graves said, checking his own watch, a simple, rugged, tactical piece. "You have 20 minutes remaining. I suggest you pack clothes." Richard grabbed a Louis Vuitton duffel bag from the shelf. He started throwing things into it indiscriminately. Silk shirts, cashmere sweaters, socks. He was hyperventilating. This was his life. It was being dismantled item by item. He grabbed a silver-framed photo from the dresser. It was a picture of him and his father on a yacht in the Mediterranean. It was the only photo he kept. "Put it back," Graves said. "It's a photo of my father," Richard shouted, clutching it to his chest. "The frame is sterling silver, engraved, valued at $600. Corporate expense." Graves recited from memory. "Take the photo out. Leave the frame." With trembling hands, Richard fumbled with the back of the frame. He tore the backing off, ripping the photo slightly in his haste. He crumpled the picture into his pocket and threw the silver frame on the floor. He zipped up the bag. It was heavy, lumpy, and pathetic. It contained the remnants of a billionaire lifestyle reduced to laundry. He walked out of the room, Graves shadowing him. At the bottom of the stairs, Audrey was waiting. She was standing by the door. Richard stopped on the bottom step. He looked at her. He wanted to say something hurtful. He wanted to crush her spirit one last time. "You'll run it into the ground," he sneered. "The company. You don't know the first thing about power. You're too soft. The wolves on the board will eat you alive by lunch tomorrow." Audrey looked at him. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked at him with a profound, terrifying pity. "You know what your father told me, Richard?" she asked softly. "He told me that you mistake cruelty for strength. You think being hard makes you powerful. But stone cracks, Richard. Water flows." She opened the door. "Goodbye, Richard." He walked out. As he stepped onto the porch, the sky opened up. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a sudden Californian storm that soaked him to the bone in seconds. He stood in the driveway holding his duffel bag, water streaming down his face, ruining his suit. He looked back at the house. The warm, golden light spilled out from the windows. He saw Maria walking through the living room, laughing at something Audrey said. The heavy oak door swung shut with a final resonant thud. Richard turned and began the long walk down the driveway to the street where no taxi was waiting. The next morning, the skyline of Los Angeles was scrubbed clean by the storm. The Sterling Tower, a 70-story needle of steel and blue glass, pierced the sky. On the 70th floor, the boardroom was buzzing with a nervous energy that bordered on panic. The board of directors of Sterling Industries was composed of 12 men and 1 woman, all of whom had been hand-picked by Richard for their loyalty, their greed, or their lack of moral scruples. Marcus Thorne, the CFO, was pacing at the head of the table. He was a man who sweated easily, and today he was drenching his collar. "This is a disaster," Thorne muttered, wiping his forehead. "The stock is down 12% in pre-market trading. The press is calling it the divorce of the century. We need to issue a statement. We need to reassure the shareholders that Richard is still involved." "He's not involved, Marcus," said Julian Vane, the COO. Vane was older, a reptile of a man who had survived 3 hostile takeovers. "He's radioactive. The judge triggered the morality clause in the charter. If we try to keep Richard on, the SEC will investigate us for fiduciary negligence. "But who is coming?" asked a junior board member. "The wife? She's a painter. What does she know about aerospace logistics? She doesn't need to know anything," Vane sneered. "She'll be a figurehead. We'll present her with a stack of papers, tell her where to sign and run the company exactly as we always have. She's likely terrified. We just need to guide her." The double doors at the end of the room swung open. The room fell silent. Audrey Sterling walked in. She wasn't wearing the beige thrift store dress from the courtroom. She was wearing a tailored navy suit that fit her perfectly. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. She wore no jewelry except for a simple gold watch, Arthur's old watch resized for her wrist. She didn't walk in looking terrified. She walked in with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Flanking her were two people. On her left was Mr. Graves, looking as dangerous as ever. On her right was a man the board members recognized instantly, and their blood ran cold. It was Elias Vance. Elias Vance had been the co-founder of Sterling Industries 40 years ago. He was the genius engineer behind their patents. But Richard, in one of his first acts as CEO, had forced Elias out in a brutal boardroom coup 5 years ago. Richard had humiliated him, stripped him of his pension, and banned him from the building. Elias was older now, leaning on a cane, but his eyes were sharp and bright. He looked at the men around the table with a predator's grin. Audrey walked to the head of the table. Marcus Thorne scrambled to get out of the CEO's chair. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus stammered. "We weren't expecting you so early. We were just drafting a press release to—" "Sit down, Marcus," Audrey said. She didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, placing her hands on the polished wood. "You were discussing how to handle me," Audrey said. Her voice was calm, but it projected to the back of the room. "You were discussing how to make me a puppet, how to guide me." Julian Vane cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sterling, please. We are merely concerned about the stability of the company. This is a complex organization. It requires experience." "I agree," Audrey said. "That is why I brought Mr. Vance." A murmur of dissent rippled through the room. "Elias Vance has no standing here," Vane protested. "He was terminated for cause. He was terminated because he refused to sign off on the faulty landing gear schematics for the Model 10 cargo plane." Audrey corrected him. She pulled a folder from her briefcase and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the surface and stopped in front of Vane. "That is the internal safety report from 2021, Audrey said. "The one Richard buried. The one you all signed off on to save $3 million in manufacturing costs." Vane went pale. He didn't touch the folder. "I spent last night reading my husband's private files," Audrey said. "Or rather, the files Arthur left for me. He documented everything. Every bribe. Every cut corner. Every safety violation." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each man. "You assume because I was quiet I was blind," Audrey said. "You assume because I was a good wife I was stupid. But while Richard was busy buying yachts, I was listening to Arthur. I know where the bodies are buried, and today we are going to start digging them up." "What are you doing?" Marcus Thorne whispered. "We are issuing a recall on the Model 10 landing gear immediately," Audrey announced. "It will cost the company $400 million. The stock will tank. Let it." "Are you insane?" Vane shouted, standing up. "You'll bankrupt us." "No," Audrey said. "I'm saving the company from the lawsuits that will happen when one of those planes crashes. We are going to rebuild the reputation of Sterling Industries from the ground up. We are going to build things that work again." She turned to Elias. "Mr. Vance is rejoining the company as Chief Technical Officer. He has full authority to fire anyone in the engineering department who puts profit over safety." Elias tapped his cane on the floor. "I've already got a list," he said with a dry chuckle. "As for the board," Audrey continued. She looked at Julian Vane. "Mr. Vane, your resignation is accepted." "I didn't resign," Vane sputtered. "You can resign," Audrey said, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. "Or I can hand this file to the Federal Aviation Administration this afternoon, and you can spend the next 10 years in federal prison for criminal negligence." Vane stared at her. He looked at the file. He looked at the faces of his colleagues, none of whom were willing to make eye contact with him. Slowly, shakily, Julian Vane gathered his things. He stood up. He looked at Audrey with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "You're crazier than Richard," he muttered. "No," Audrey replied. "I just have a conscience, something this room has been missing for a long time." Vane walked out. Audrey looked at the remaining board members. "Anyone else want to leave, or are we ready to get to work?" Silence. Then Marcus Thorne slowly opened his notebook. "What is the first item on the agenda?" "Madame." "Tall woman." Audrey sat down in the leather chair. It was too big for her, but she didn't shrink into it. She filled the space. "Item 1, she said. "We need to talk about the employees, the janitors, the secretaries, the factory floor workers, the people Richard ignored. We're raising the minimum wage across the company by 20%. The room gasped. Audrey smiled. It wasn't a smirk. It was a genuine smile. "Let the shareholders scream," she said. "We're playing the long game now." 3 weeks later, Richard Sterling sat in the dim light of the Starlight Motel. The room smelled of mildew, a far cry from the Bel Air estate. On the small, crackling television, a news anchor chirped. "Sterling Industries stock has soared following the safety recall. New chairwoman Audrey Sterling is being hailed as a visionary." Richard threw his empty whiskey glass at the wall, shattering it. "Visionary," he screamed. "She's giving away my money." Delusion had set in. He convinced himself that if he could just speak to the shareholders directly, they would see reason. They would realize Audrey was an imposter and reinstate him. He pulled a wrinkled rented tuxedo from a plastic bag and dressed with shaking hands. He had one last card to play. That evening, the downtown Hilton was a fortress of light. The New Horizons gala was in full swing. Inside the ballroom, Audrey stood at the podium, breathtaking in emerald green silk. Beside her stood Elias Vance, the reinstated CTO, and Mr. Graves, her head of security. Audrey took a breath, addressing the crowd of 500 investors and politicians. "My late father-in-law built this company on a promise of safety. Tonight we renew that promise. We are putting people before profits." Lies. The scream tore through the room. The feedback from a stolen microphone squealed, making the crowd wince. Richard Sterling stepped out from the shadows of the stage wing. He looked manic, his tuxedo ill-fitting sweat dripping down his face. The crowd gasped. "Richard!" Audrey stepped back, shocked. "Don't look at her!" Richard bellowed to the crowd, stumbling into the spotlight. "I am the CEO. I built this company. She is nothing but a painter who manipulated a senile old man." Security moved to intercept, but Audrey raised a hand. "Let him speak," she said calmly. Richard laughed, a broken, desperate sound. See, she knows I'm right. You can't fire me. I know where the skeletons are buried. Audrey looked at her ex-husband. She didn't feel fear anymore, only pity. She reached under the podium and pulled out a blue file folder. "Go ahead, Richard," she said. Her voice amplified through the hall. "Tell them about the skeletons, because I found the last one this morning." Richard faltered. "What?" Audrey opened the folder. "I wasn't going to do this. I wanted to let you walk away with some dignity. But you forced my hand." She held up a document for the crowd to see. "During our forensic audit, we found a discrepancy in the Project Icarus Fund, the budget for our new engine safety prototypes." The room went deadly silent. $20 million was missing. Audrey continued, her voice steel. "It was transferred to a shell company in Panama called Rasputin Holdings, and the sole signatory on that account is Richard Arthur Sterling." Richard's face went ghost white. The microphone slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a loud thud. "You didn't just cut corners, Richard," Audrey declared. "You embezzled $20 million from the very shareholders you claim to protect. That isn't just a fireable offense. It's a federal crime." Audrey looked toward the back of the room. "Detective Miller, he's all yours." The double doors swung open. 4 police officers marched down the aisle. Richard looked left and right, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The investors he had once charmed now looked at him with pure disgust. "Audrey, please," he whispered, as the officers grabbed his arms. "I'm your husband." "Ex-husband," Audrey corrected. As they handcuffed him and dragged him off the stage, Richard began to sob the cry of a man who had finally been told no. The doors closed behind him, leaving a heavy silence in the ballroom. Slowly, Elias Vance started to clap. Then the CFO joined in. Within moments, the entire room was on its feet, a thunderous ovation washing over Audrey. She stood tall, letting the applause wash away the last 10 years of fear. 6 months later. The wind rustled through the cypress trees of the private cemetery overlooking Los Angeles. Audrey knelt before a simple marble headstone, Arthur James Sterling. "You knew," she whispered, placing white lilies on the grass. "You knew he would steal. You set the trap, Arthur, and you knew I would be the one to spring it. The company is safe now." "Mrs. Sterling." Audrey turned. A young female reporter stood nearby, notebook in hand. "I'm sorry to intrude. I'm writing a profile on the company's turnaround. Everyone calls you the Iron Widow or the Avenging Angel. What do you call yourself?" Audrey looked out over the city. Somewhere down there, in a federal cell, Richard was serving the first year of a 15-year sentence. Somewhere else, the Sterling Tower gleamed in the sun, a symbol of integrity reborn. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in a decade. "Just Audrey," she said. "I'm just Audrey." So that is the story of how Richard Sterling's arrogance became his prison, and how Audrey found her voice in the ruins of her marriage. It proves that while money can buy lawyers and jets, it cannot buy character, and it certainly cannot hide the truth forever. Richard thought he was signing a divorce paper, but he was actually signing a confession. What do you think? Did Richard deserve the jail time, or was losing his fortune enough punishment? And would you have had the courage to stand up to the board like Audrey did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have plenty more dramatic tales coming your way. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.